Hey, hello again. Periods 1 and 2. Carl Wilkins here. Yeah, I don't know why I had to say that. I am really happy that we can get back into your questions, the ones we didn't finish. And I hope that I am right in picking up. I think, Jessica, part of me thinks this might have been the last question we talked about, and maybe we didn't get to it. So let's look at it again. The hardest part or situation for you about the genocide in terms of what you had to endure and see. Well, yeah, the loss of life, innocent people. You know, it's surprising that during the genocide, I didn't see as much of the as many of the people who were killed and stuff as after the genocide. I remember, just a few days after the genocide ended, I went looking for a good friend of mine, my administrative assistant, in his home about 20 kilometers from Kigali. Wonderful gardener, a big forest he had planted around his house, an amazing guy. And the forest had been chopped down and the fields were full of families who had been killed. And nobody was around at his home. After walking through the fields of bodies and then getting to his house, and his house was completely torn apart, looted, everything gone, and getting word that his wife had been killed, that was actually the first time that I cried. I didn't cry throughout the genocide, which is kind of interesting. I think you're holding yourself up until then. Those are some of the tough memories still with me. The biggest thing you learned from the genocide, I would say probably I'm much more intentional about finding the good. I mean, I go back and forth. One of the things I learned is how I feel like I'm maybe super sensitive to us and them thinking, divisive thinking. That puts some out and leaves some in. And at the same time, the good side of things, I think about finding the good being such an important strategy in life. Finding the good helps me to reframe myself. It helps me to reframe a situation, helps me to reframe the other. So those are a couple thoughts. Thanks, Jessica. Good question. James N. Group. Now that you've had time to reflect, yeah, that's big enough. I think you can read that too, huh? On your experience in the Rwanda genocide, what is one thing you wish you could have done differently? Well, James, for years, I used to tell people I wish I would have learned Kinyarwanda, because that's true, and it's a safe wish. The one that I didn't talk about for years until I finally had a session with my counselor. I hope we talked. I talked with several different groups. I hope I talked with you about getting professional help for mental, emotional wounds, how much of a believer I am in getting professional help, how much a believer I am in journaling, and how much a believer I am in support groups. My wife, my family, an enormous support group for me. And it was in one of those visits with the counselors. I don't even remember why it came up, but I did share with him this time, the last day of the genocide, when the RPF were taking over. And you guys, you would have read that, okay, you know the details because you read that chapter in the book. But what I didn't write in the book, because I was I was ashamed. One of our neighbors, he came looking for refuge that last day of the genocide when the RPF were taking over our neighborhood. And I was fairly convinced that he had been involved in the killing, and I was fearful of letting him in our house for fear. I didn't know what he'd do. I knew the RPF soldiers would be there soon, and I thought, I can't let this guy in my house because he's been involved with the genocide. I mean, it wasn't 100%, but I'm fairly certain. And I told him, just do what the soldiers tell you. You'll be fine. Don't believe all the lies on the radio. Just do. And I found out when we moved back 7 months later, the family was there right across the road from us, but he wasn't. And I found out he had been killed. And I was quite convinced that he had been killed that day because I hadn't let him in my house. And as I talked with the as I talked with the counselor about this, how deeply I regretted it and, ashamed, he helped me identify a few things that were really important. I think I might have mentioned to you about these unexamined unconscious beliefs. Well, one that I was holding was that he had died that day, and I never really examined it. And when I talked with the counselor, I realized we didn't have facts. I didn't know when he had died. He could have died in the Congo with the thousands of people who died from cholera. There were many possibilities, but I still thought, but maybe he died that day. And I think what's really important about regrets is that we can have a safe place to talk about them, and then we can learn something from them, and then we can forgive ourselves. Like we would hopefully want to forgive others. And what I felt I learned, one of the things I felt I learned was, I wish not that I would have let him in the house, but that would have offered to stay with him by the gate until the soldiers came. I felt if I would have offered that, I could have used my presence to just be with him. And if he would have said, no, I'm out of here, then that would have been his choice. But I wouldn't have been turning my back and closing the gate and walking away, for which I do regret. Thanks for that. Thanks for that question, James. Amelia, how did you make the decision to trust and take the word of the orchestrator of the genocide that the massacre at the orphanage wasn't going to happen? I don't think I had any choice. I don't know that it was trust. I think I was just doing everything I knew possible. And then trusting, probably for me, it would be more of a matter of trusting God. Having said that, I don't know if we've had a conversation with your class about God and faith and genocide and restoration. If we haven't and you'd like to read about that, I did write a letter back to a student. If your teacher hasn't shared it with you yet, you can check with your teacher and can share that letter about my understanding of God and how God works through people. Your other question, what were the thoughts when meeting the Prime Minister? I was just desperate. I was desperate. I knew he could do it, but I really didn't think he would. It was, I think what was most important about that whole encounter was, one, listening to the secretary. I often pull up this picture when I'm talking about that story, because this picture has just become so incredibly important to me. I don't have a photo or anything of that time, but I think what's super important is listening to the local people. Also really important was being there. Maybe not what I said as much as just being present. And the third thing I would add is probably the power of ask. To ask can be really powerful. Sometimes I think we underestimate the power of asking. That the potential for good is in everybody. And I sure wasn't thinking the potential for good was in this guy. But since then, I've become really, I practice that thinking, and I try to practice that in my life. The idea that the potential for good is in everybody. Sometimes your most important ally might be somebody who we'd label an enemy. Okay, wait, let's get back to our questions here. How did you know to keep a tape journal that documented your days and events, what happened? I actually just did it for my wife and children. I thought, if I die, I want to leave them stories. It was just that simple, because I knew they could be struggling with the decision that Teresa and I made for me to stay. My wife could be struggling with that decision. Our kids could have been struggling. So if I died, maybe those stories would help them understand a little more what the decision was really about to stay. So thanks. That's a good question. I don't think many people have asked me that one. Bill, would your goals, point of view be different if you were more involved in the genocide in those first 3 weeks? Good question. I haven't thought about that. I kind of can't, I don't think so. Man, I wish we were still here live, because I'd like to ask you a little more about that question. But, it would have been a terribly traumatizing experience to have been out there in the early days of the killing. But I honestly can't think of how my goals or point of views would have been different. I'm going to have to think on that one some more. Good question. Aiden and group, let's see if I pronounce your name right. Do you think a situation like that could repeat in another country in Africa or else in the world? And what are the lessons that politicians, oh my goodness, can learn from the Rwandan case? Yeah, serious. Well, the first part is not serious laughing. The first part is, yes, it could happen. I think that anywhere where people are motivated, I mean, everywhere, not anywhere, everywhere people are seriously impacted by fear. Fear impacts, interferes with certain brain processing, and fear is an incredibly powerful force. But then too, if we hand over our choice, the decision, our moral responsibility, if we hand that over to somebody else, terrible things like that could happen. I think what's also important in your question here is, how is it happening now? How is the thinking, my world would be better without you in it? That kind of genocide thinking. How is that impacting other groups today? I really like the term identity. Well, I don't like it, but I think it's a very useful term, identity-based violence. I think that term is really useful, excuse me, because it, I just had a good meal, I'm sorry. It's a useful term because it expands beyond genocide. And when we have thinking that we're going to solve a problem, basically excluding somebody, it may not be physical violence, but excluding somebody, social violence, emotional, verbal violence, when we think we're going to solve something like that, it's only going to be temporary at best, and genocide or identity-based violence at worst. So I think those are some of the lessons that politicians could definitely learn, that the only way to have lasting solutions is to have a restorative approach. I think I probably showed you all this picture before, but I'm going to pop this up, because if I was talking with a group of politicians, I actually want to talk with anybody. I found this really useful for my own self-reflection, okay? Not trying to judge other people, but this idea of a pathway to harm and a pathway to healing. And that the pathway to harm is just really captured in polarizing speech, polarizing actions, polarizing thinking, us and them separating thinking. Whereas the pathway to healing is really captured in restorative thinking, in restorative vocabularies, non-violent restorative, violent, divisive, polarizing. So all the way from how we treat our political opponents, how we treat our politicians, their staff, how we treat everybody, how we treat ourselves. I think often we can be very divided and conflicted. That's probably a good word, huh? We can be conflicted with ourselves if we have been practicing polarizing self-talk. Oh, you should have. And see, polarizing self-talk is like, we know it's not going to get any better. That kind of talk. It's only going to get worse. It's this way or it's that way. That's polarizing talk. Whereas restorative talk is, wait, there's got to be a way. I'm sure if we get enough people, we got to find some more ideas. And so there's an optimism too in restorative part, and there's a pessimism in the pathway to harm. So those are a few thoughts, and I'm thinking before this tape gets too long. Well, wait, let's do one more question, and then I'll probably stop it. We'll make a second one for the last questions. What are your feelings after the matter towards those who perpetrated the genocide, but also assisted you in rescuing orphans and other people? For example, the Prime Minister. Is it a matter of resentment or neutrality? And no neutrality. It's interesting. It's not one or the other, huh? There is definite resentment, I'm sure. I've tried to get rid of that anger and bitterness, and I'm intentional about getting free from anger and bitterness. But I also, there's certain, I think back to a situation and there's incredible gratitude. So gratitude and resentment. And I think one of the things that helps me in dealing with gratitude and resentment towards the same person is this idea that, again, forgive me guys, because it's been a couple of days and I've talked to several other student groups if we talked about it, but my stop sign, stopping one thing thinking, I think this idea of thinking one thing thinking, about a person, an organization, a country, an institution, anything. One thing thinking can be super dangerous, super limiting. And so, I could have answered your question with one thing thinking. You said neutrality or resentment. Life is almost always multi-layered. And what I think is helpful in this situation, in terms of, thinking of gratitude and resentment, is the idea of not defining somebody by their worst actions. Constantly defining somebody by their worst actions, which would be, I was trying to think of another graphic, it would be this graphic probably too, one thing thinking, defining them by their worst actions. So, my feelings towards them are resentment and gratitude, but I think as time goes on, I'm at least telling myself, even though I haven't had a chance to meet them and talk with them and form new pathways in my brain, that everybody has the potential to change. And so I can live with having had those different feelings. The problem with resentment is if I keep it for a long time, it kind of turns into bitterness. And that's a poison in my thinking, in my whole life. And I don't want that. So letting go of that resentment, I'd say Rwandans who have let go have been a big encouragement to me to let go. So we'll break, and then